Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Daterra Natural Processed Brazil from Passenger Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Passenger, based out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And they're one of our most featured American coffee roasters on this channel, as they're one of my favorite coffee roasters in the entire world. I wanted to give a quick shout out to Goblin, as they said that this was their favorite coffee from the entirety of 2023 in our top 10 coffees of 2023 video. So I figured we would add this one on anytime we placed a passenger order. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out for us, as this right here is day 39. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Passenger's recipe, which is a 15.625 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, as we've mentioned in the past, Passenger is one of the lighter roasting American coffee roasters out there. But as we've also mentioned in the past, it's a little bit more difficult to tell when it comes to more processed coffees. This one is not quite as light as the Monte Carlos Pacamara that we had recently reviewed, but it still turned out a little bit lighter than I might have been expecting. So for this one, I would say on the lighter side of that medium light in terms of that roast profile. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the cup definitely came out a fair bit more intense than initially expected, as it wasn't a straightforward one-note Brazilian in terms of the nuttiness to it, but rather offering a much more chocolate-focused base with a slight bitterness to it. In addition to that, there was an interesting minty and herbal quality also present within the cup, as well as some slight cherry, resulting in a just okay first start. Continue on to day 17 as we opted for the Chemex, and the cup was notably improved as it offered greater clarity, with the focus now being much more on the listed cherry in a cleaner washed sense, as opposed to the much more heavy fermenty natural like aspects that you can experience from a little bit more processed coffees. Felt better defined, which lent itself to a surprisingly nice day. Continue on to day 20 as we opted for the April brewer, and there was a significant more fermentiness in the cup, as it felt just significantly heavier, as the previously mentioned cherry now felt significantly more fermenty, while the chocolate base offered some slightly heavier aspects, lending itself to another just okay day. So as of this moment, we've had a little bit of a roller coaster, but that would continue on day 23 as we opted for the V60 with Passenger's recipe. And honestly, I did not think that this would work. I did not think that pushing this coffee would improve it in any regard, as it already felt a little too heavy and intense for me. But interestingly enough, it just seemed to work, as the entire cup felt better structure and balance to it, with significantly more clarity to it. The previous day's heavier aspects were significantly more toned down, and a better defined chocolate base complemented some cleaner dark fruits, including a dark cherry as well as a dark plum attribute, giving it a just significantly better day. But that was the best day I'd experienced of this coffee, as we went back to the Chemex with Passenger's recipe on day 26, and I also did not think that this would work. And this was much more in line with what I was expecting, as it felt a fair bit more fermenty on this day. Chocolate base now felt significantly more robust, as there's darker berries again, but those also felt a little bit heavier. Least enjoyable day up to this moment, as all of the aspects in this one were significantly more fermenty, heavy, and offering significantly less clarity. Day 29 through the V60 with lower temperatures, and this did not seem to help either, as the cup continued to be more heavy and intense than some of the earlier days, as there was more of the accentuated focus on the listed cherry, but also in a much more fermenty sense. Pretty robust cup with an abundance of dark berries, lending itself to another just okay day. Continue on to day 32, and at this moment I was just trying to figure out a way to get this coffee to the best I'd experienced, and we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe, and this did not seem to help, as it was offering more of the heaviness and robust chocolate aspects yet again. And I think I noticed that this coffee had just continued to increase in terms of the intensity over time, as there was a bit more nuttiness on the cool down, and some adjustments were needed to kind of get this coffee at the place I wanted it to be. And given that the best experience we had was on that day 23 mark with Passenger's recipe on the V60, tried that one more time. It did not seem to work on this day, as unsurprisingly the cup came out pretty intense, and that's what I was expecting the first time I tried this coffee, as there was many more of the heavier chocolate aspects dominating the cup. There is a strong red fruit aspect in line with the listed cherry yet again, This one was very lingering and long lasting, and it was one of those coffees that I was feeling and tasting for a very long time. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 2 level 5s, so let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the finish, level 5. And it's fitting that that's the last note that we had on the days themselves, and it transitioned right into this tasting wheel. As I mentioned, that once I took that sip, I was tasting it for a very long time, and I'm going to continue to taste this coffee for a very long time. It skews very much in that much darker, robust chocolate base to it, and it does leave that in a very lingering and lasting sense, as well as that slight herbal and minty quality, though that's a little bit more toned down relative to the heavier aspects in it. Those heavier aspects you are experiencing for a extended period of time. Chocolate level 5, that's the other level 5 that we were mentioning, and that's the biggest culprit of that very long-lasting finish. And going into this one, I said, okay, we're probably gonna get a pretty chocolate-forward coffee, but this one right here, it just offered so much intensity to it and a long-lasting, I would say at times very well-defined, but at other times much too heavy and robust chocolate components to it. So it is one of the more chocolate-forward coffees we've reviewed in quite a bit, hence earning itself that level 5 mark. A couple of level 4s. We'll start with the body level 4. What's really fun about the body is that I was making this coffee side by side with that Monte Carlos Pacamara, and I was really surprised that that one reached that level 5, mostly because that one was brewed with the Chemex, but they were very close in terms of the overall body to both of those coffees, and this one, of course, being on the heavier side of that body, which is a little bit more expected with the brew method for this coffee. I think I was just a little surprised that they both had such a high body, especially compared side by side, both earning that level 4 mark. Then we have the sweetness, level 4. So yes, this one was very sweet, but specifically in the sense that I wasn't enjoying too much, a little bit more in terms of the just fermenting qualities. Typically when it comes to heavier processed coffees, you can experience just that sweetness that goes alongside of it, even if it's not necessarily the enjoyable side of that sweetness. Mostly thinking the intense cherry fruit sweetness as well as that intense chocolate sweetness, though the chocolate wasn't skewing much on the sweeter side of things, it was skewing on a different side of things, which we'll get into in a little bit. Berry fruit, level 4. So one of the better things I do have to say about this coffee is that it didn't offer too heavy, too overbearing of a berry aspect to it. And typically when it comes to more processed coffees, I've experienced those scoring that level 5 alongside of the finish, alongside of the sweetness. And I say all of these factors are a little too intense for me. This one right here, at times the berry was very nice, that cherry aspect of it. At times it felt a little bit more in a washed sense. And when it was that level, I was enjoying the coffee significantly more, but I found it difficult to get it back to that level no matter what sort of adjustments we had made. And then we have a couple of level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Not necessarily the brightest coffee, and I'm not entirely sure where I was expecting this one to fall in terms of the acidity of it, but it was a little bit more medium in terms of that. Spice level 3, I mentioned pretty early on that there's a slight minty herbal quality to it. That was present for the entirety of this coffee, although significantly more subdued relative to the heavier and more intense aspects of this coffee. Stone fruit, level 3. Briefly mentioned a dark stone fruit, those plums specifically, as I think that was one of the better felt components in it when the cup felt a little cleaner, though I think that was overshadowed by the heavier berry attributes of it when it was less clean. Caramel level 3. Yeah, there is a slight caramelized aspect to it, and I want to say in terms of the nutty sense, but once again, that was overshadowed by the other heavier, intense attributes of this coffee. Bitterness, level 3, and that's what I was referencing when I was talking about the chocolate, as that is entirely the chocolate. It's a much more bitter chocolate, a much more dark chocolate, a high percentage cacao, if you want to say. Nonetheless, it was one of the less enjoyable parts of this coffee, as it just felt like a very bitter, dark chocolate in that regard. Savoriness, level 3. So yeah, that also is in terms of that nutty quality, also that kind of interesting herbality to it. So that was pretty high, especially given some of the earlier impressions I'd had of this coffee. I didn't expect it to reach that level. I was expecting this to maybe not be the most nutty Brazilian coffee, and it honestly wasn't, but it was present enough to kind of score at that level 3 mark. And then the final thing we're discussing, and the most important thing, the cleanliness, level 3. Probably a little generous if I'm being completely honest. There were some days where I'm like, this is a 2 at best, and then there were some days where I'm like, okay, we're stretching a higher side of level 3, especially on the days where it felt much more like a wash processed coffee, which is honestly what I was expecting. Going into this, I was expecting it to act like a wash processed coffee, as generally natural processed Brazilian coffees act like wash processed coffees. That unfortunately was not the case with this one, and when I made this tasting well, I said, you're being a little generous. It's maybe one of the heavier, more fermenting coffees that we've experienced in this vein specifically, natural processed Brazilian coffees. But at the end, I said, Okay, I was able to get some definition to some of the profiles in this one, and it's not necessarily the most heavy or fermenty coffee. It's not too overbearing. So I feel like the level 3 was a little generous, but it's where I opted to put it on this tasting wheel. But as I'm looking at it, other than that, I think this is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I don't think it'll come as a big surprise to anybody that this one was not necessarily my favorite coffee, as people know in general that I don't tend to prefer the more intense coffees. And going into this one, I had this idea that this one was probably going to be a little bit better balanced. And reading the profile, the description, everything that went along this coffee, I said, on paper, there's no reason I should like this coffee, but I went into it with a very open mind, and it was much more in line with the expectations that I had had. Though in certain regards, on paper, what I read about this coffee, I said, yeah, it's not going to be my type of coffee. But thinking back to the natural processed Brazilian coffees we have reviewed in the past, I said, maybe it'll surprise me. Maybe it'll be a little cleaner than I'm expecting. But unfortunately, it was a little bit more on the first side of things. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. There are some really nice positives that can be taken away. I mean, obviously it was somebody's favorite coffee of the entire year, and I think those are most specifically in the chocolate and cherry direction, as if you like that kind of cherry cordial note to coffees, and I think that this one's a pretty good fit for that, though it may not necessarily be as heavy and intense in terms of the boozy cherry aspect, but there is enough of a very strong and defined cherry attribute in terms of the heavier sense as well as the chocolate that can go really well in that regard. It's not necessarily going to be the most funky or most fermenty processed coffee out there, as it still offered at least a little bit of clarity throughout time, and it still offers some really strong intensity for those that do enjoy their more intense coffees. But I think that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts or impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Daterra natural processed Brazil from Passenger Coffee. Thank you for watching.